Still VFib. No pulse. Charging to 200.
Under the harsh midday sun, right outside a busy hospital entrance, Nancy Wanjala lay motionless on the scorching concrete, her breath shallow and uneven. Heat shimmered in the air as people hurried past, shielding their eyes, pretending not to see her trembling body. Kneeling beside her was Hannah Abiola, a young nurse in a faded uniform, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse that felt dangerously weak. She looked up at the hospital's glass doors, clean, bright, and firmly closed. A security guard avoided her eyes and slowly shook his head. "She won't survive out here," Hannah whispered, her voice breaking. In that moment, Hannah understood the truth. If she stepped inside with Nancy, she would lose her job. If she didn't, a human life would end right there in the sun. And the choice she made would change everything. Before we begin this story, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if stories of kindness, justice, and unexpected destiny touch your heart, don't forget to subscribe. Hannah Abiola had learned early in life that compassion was not something the world rewarded easily. She woke before sunrise every day in a single rented room at the edge of the city where the walls were thin and the power came and went without warning. The air was often heavy, even in the early morning, and the sounds of buses and street vendors drifted in before dawn. Hannah would sit on the edge of her narrow bed, tying the laces of her worn shoes, whispering a short prayer before another long shift at the hospital. She was not born into comfort. Her mother had been a market woman, strong, stubborn, endlessly kind, who raised Hannah on stories of dignity and faith. "If you see pain and you turn away," her mother used to say, "then one day the world will turn away from you too." Those words stayed with Hannah long after her mother passed, echoing in her mind every time she put on her nurse's uniform. The hospital where Hannah worked was one of the largest public medical centers in the region. On paper, it existed to serve everyone. In reality, it served those who could pay, those who knew someone important, and those who understood how the system worked. Every day, long queues formed outside its gates, mothers holding feverish children, elderly men leaning on sticks, young laborers injured at construction sites. Not all of them made it inside. Hannah noticed these things even when she tried not to. Inside the hospital, the pace was relentless. Stretchers crowded the corridors. Nurses rushed from ward to ward, their faces tight with exhaustion. Doctors barked orders, phones rang endlessly, and arguments about bed space and supplies filled the air. Over time, many staff members learned how to harden themselves, how to stop seeing faces and start seeing files, payments, and procedures. Hannah struggled with that lesson. She was known among a few patients as the soft nurse, the one who explained things slowly, who adjusted pillows, who stayed a little longer than required. To some colleagues, that softness was a weakness. To others, it was simply inconvenient. Nurse Zainab Sadiq noticed it more than anyone. Zainab had worked at the hospital for years and wore her seniority like armor. She believed rules existed for a reason, and breaking them, even with good intentions, only invited chaos. When she watched Hannah bend over patients others ignored, she would click her tongue and shake her head. "This place will swallow you," Zainab once told her during a short break. "If you don't learn to protect yourself, you'll be the one bleeding." Hannah had smiled politely, though the words unsettled her. She didn't argue. She never did. But deep down, she believed there had to be another way to survive without losing herself. On the day Nancy Wanjala appeared outside the hospital, Hannah was already running on little sleep. The ward had been short-staffed the night before, and she had covered an extra shift. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and the sun outside felt unusually harsh. She had stepped out briefly to get some air when she noticed a small disturbance near the gate. At first, she thought it was just another argument between security and a patient's family. Those were common. But then she saw the woman on the ground. Nancy did not look dramatic. She wasn't shouting or begging. She lay still, her clothes dusty, her body thin in a way that spoke of long hunger rather than sudden illness. Her lips were cracked, her eyes half open but unfocused, as if she were already drifting somewhere far away. People stepped around her. Some glanced briefly and then looked away. Others shook their heads, murmuring about madness or trouble. A few slowed down, uncertain, before deciding it was safer to keep moving. Hannah felt something tighten in her chest. She approached carefully, kneeling beside Nancy despite the heat radiating from the concrete. She placed 2 fingers on the woman's neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, but faint, uneven, alarming. "She needs help," Hannah said, looking up at the nearest guard. The man frowned, uncomfortable. "No card, no payment," he replied quietly, as if ashamed. "Orders." Hannah's eyes moved to the glass doors just beyond him. Inside, she could see the cool brightness of the lobby, the controlled chaos of a working hospital. Everything Nancy needed was only a few steps away. She looked back at the woman on the ground. In that moment, Hannah's mind filled with fragments. Her mother's voice, the faces of patients she had watched slip away, the warnings from colleagues, the rules she had memorized and followed for years. She knew exactly what bringing Nancy inside would mean. Questions, reports, consequences. She also knew what leaving her there would mean. Hannah stayed where she was, her hand resting lightly on Nancy's shoulder as if grounding herself. She spoke softly, though she wasn't sure the woman could hear. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please." From an upper office window, unseen by Hannah, a pair of eyes watched the scene below. The observer did not yet know Hannah's name, nor the chain of events that had already been set in motion. But something about the stillness of that kneeling nurse, about the quiet refusal to walk away, stirred a memory long buried. And elsewhere in the city, a man named Oluwafemi Oyekale went about his morning unaware that a choice made under the midday sun was about to reach him swiftly, inevitably, and with consequences no one could have predicted. For Hannah Abiola, this was only the beginning. Nancy Wanjala did not remember how long she had been lying there. Time for her had stopped behaving like it did for other people. Minutes stretched into something shapeless, and pain came in waves, sometimes sharp and blinding, sometimes dull and distant. The heat pressed down on her chest like a heavy hand, making each breath feel like borrowed air. What she did remember was hunger. Not the kind that came after missing a meal, but the deep gnawing emptiness that lived in her bones. The kind that made her body weak long before her spirit gave up. For days, maybe weeks, she had drifted through the city, sleeping in abandoned corners, surviving on scraps offered by kind strangers and ignored by many more. That morning she had walked toward the hospital because she had no other place left to go. Inside her body, something was failing. She felt it with every step. Her legs trembled, her vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. By the time she reached the gate, her strength was gone. Now she lay on the concrete, half aware of the noise around her. Voices rose and fell, footsteps passed, shadows moved across her face. Somewhere nearby, someone was arguing. "She can't stay here. She's blocking the entrance. Call the shelter." Nancy tried to speak, but her mouth would not obey her. Then she felt a touch. It was gentle, careful, different from the rough hands that had pushed her away before. Fingers searched for her pulse warm against her skin. A voice followed, soft, steady, close. "Can you hear me?" Nancy opened her eyes slightly. The face above her was framed by the bright light of the sun, but she could make out kind eyes, worry etched deep into them. For a moment she thought she was imagining it. Hannah Abiola felt her stomach twist as Nancy's eyes fluttered open and then shut again. "She's crashing," Hannah said, her voice firm now. "She needs immediate attention." Nurse Zainab Sadiq had stepped closer, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was controlled, but there was irritation in her eyes. "Hannah, you're not assigned here," Zainab said sharply. "Leave this to security." Hannah looked up at her colleague, disbelief flickering across her face. "She needs oxygen, fluids, at least an assessment." Zainab shook her head. "And who will pay for it?" "You." The words landed hard. Other staff members had begun to notice the scene. A junior nurse slowed her steps, watching with wide eyes. A porter paused, uncertain. No one intervened. "This is not how it works," Zainab continued, lowering her voice. "You know the rules. No admission without registration." Hannah stood slowly, brushing dust from her knees. "Rules are meant to protect people," she said, "not kill them." Zainab's jaw tightened. "Careful," she warned. "You're crossing a line." Hannah glanced back at Nancy, whose breathing had grown more erratic. Each rise of her chest seemed to take effort. Hannah's training kicked in automatically. She noted the pallor of Nancy's skin, the dryness of her lips, the faintness of her pulse. "This woman won't survive another hour out here," Hannah said. "If we wait, it will be too late." Zainab looked away toward the hospital doors. For a brief second, something like doubt passed through her eyes. Then it hardened into resolve. "Step aside," she said. "Security will handle it." As if summoned, one of the guards took a step forward, uncertainty written all over his face. He looked from Zainab to Hannah, then down at Nancy. "Please," Hannah said quietly, meeting his eyes. "Help me get her inside." The guard hesitated. He wasn't cruel. He was just afraid of losing his job, afraid of breaking orders, afraid of consequences that always seemed to fall hardest on people like him. "I can't," he muttered. "I'm sorry." Hannah felt anger rise in her chest, sharp and hot, but beneath it was something else, fear. Not for herself, but for the woman gasping on the ground. She made her decision. Without waiting for permission, Hannah bent down, slipped one arm under Nancy's shoulders and tried to lift her. Nancy was lighter than Hannah expected, alarmingly so. "What are you doing?" Zainab snapped. "Saving her life," Hannah replied. It wasn't graceful. Nancy groaned softly as Hannah struggled to get her upright. The sun beat down on them, and Hannah's muscles burned with effort. The junior nurse gasped, taking an involuntary step forward, then froze when Zainab shot her a warning look. Zainab called out, "Stop this right now." Hannah didn't. She took one step toward the doors, then another. The guard moved to block her path, his hands raised. "Sister, please," he said. "Don't make this harder." Hannah looked at him, tears stinging her eyes. "If she dies here," she said, her voice shaking, "we all live with it." For a long moment, no one spoke. The glass doors reflected the scene back at them. A nurse holding a dying woman, staff frozen in indecision, a system watching itself fail. Finally, the guard stepped aside. Hannah pushed through the doors, her heart pounding. The cool air of the lobby hit her like a shock. Heads turned, conversations stopped. A receptionist stared, mouth open. "Emergency." Hannah called out, "I need a bed now." The word spread quickly. Within minutes, Nancy was on a stretcher wheeled into a small treatment area usually reserved for overflow cases. Hannah moved with focused urgency, checking vitals, calling for supplies, ignoring the growing knot of tension behind her. She knew cameras were watching. She knew reports would be written. She knew this moment would not be forgiven easily. But as Nancy's breathing steadied slightly under oxygen, Hannah felt a fragile sense of relief. Not victory, just the quiet knowledge that for now a life was still hanging on. From the corridor, Nurse Zainab watched, her face unreadable. "This won't end well," she murmured to herself. And somewhere unseen and unheard, the hospital's silent witnesses, the cameras, the records, the system itself continued to observe, capturing every choice, every step, every act of defiance. For Hannah Abiola, the line had been crossed. There was no going back. The small treatment room was never meant for cases like Nancy Wanjala. It was a narrow space tucked between two busy wards, usually used when the hospital overflowed or when someone needed to be stabilized briefly before being transferred elsewhere. The walls were bare, the equipment minimal. Still, to Hannah Abiola, it felt like a sanctuary compared to the scorching pavement outside. Nancy lay on the bed, her chest rising and falling unevenly as oxygen flowed through the thin tubing pressed against her nose. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused, then closed again. Hannah stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on the woman's wrist, counting each fragile beat. "Blood pressure is dangerously low," Hannah muttered, more to herself than anyone else. She reached for an IV line, her movements quick and practiced. Years of training had taken over, pushing fear and doubt to the back of her mind. A junior nurse hovered near the door, glancing nervously into the corridor. "Sister Hannah, they're asking questions," she whispered. Hannah didn't look up. "Tell them I'll explain later." The young nurse hesitated. "It's Nurse Zainab. She's not happy." Hannah allowed herself a brief, bitter smile. She never is. As fluids began to drip into Nancy's vein, Hannah studied the woman's face more closely. There were old scars on her arms, faint but unmistakable. Her nails were cracked and dirty, her skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. This was not the face of someone who had simply fallen ill overnight. This was the face of a long struggle. "What happened to you?" Hannah whispered. Nancy stirred her lips, moving slightly. No sound came out at first. Hannah leaned closer. "Water," Nancy breathed. Hannah quickly wet a small sponge and gently touched it to Nancy's lips. "Easy," she said softly. "You're safe for now." Safe. The word felt fragile, almost dishonest. Hannah knew how temporary safety could be in a place like this. Outside the room, tension spread like a slow-burning fire. Nurse Zainab stood near the nurses' station, her arms crossed tightly, watching staff hurry past. She had already made a call to the administrative office, to the head nurse, to anyone who would listen. "This is a clear violation," she said into the phone, her voice controlled but sharp. She brought in an unidentified patient without registration, without approval. "Yes," I warned her. She ended the call and exhaled slowly. Zainab did not see herself as cruel. In her mind, she was protecting order, protecting the hospital from becoming a shelter it could not sustain. She had seen what happened when rules were bent too often, shortages, chaos, blame falling on those who tried to be kind. Still, a small, unwelcome voice inside her asked a question she did not like. What if she's right? Zainab pushed the thought away. Back in the treatment room, Nancy's breathing became slightly more regular. Hannah felt a cautious sense of relief, though she knew they were far from out of danger. She checked the chart, scribbling notes, quickly aware that every word might later be used against her. A doctor finally appeared at the doorway, a tired-looking man with lines etched deep into his face. He glanced at Nancy, then at Hannah. Who approved this? He asked. I did? Hannah replied, meeting his eyes. She collapsed outside. She needed immediate care. The doctor sighed. You know this will cause trouble, I know, Hannah said quietly, but she would have died. The doctor studied Nancy for a moment longer, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Stabilize her. I'll check back. It wasn't full support, but it wasn't opposition either. Hannah took it as a small mercy. As the hours passed, fragments of Nancy's past began to surface in murmured words and half-formed sentences. Used to sell vegetables, Nancy whispered at one point, her eyes still closed. Hannah leaned in. Where? Near the bus park. Nancy said faintly. Long time ago. What happened? Hannah asked gently. A pause, then barely audible fire. Hannah felt her throat tighten. She didn't press further. Some stories revealed themselves slowly when they were ready. By late afternoon, the hospital administration could no longer ignore what was happening. Dr. Kwame Adebayo, the hospital director, strode into the ward with an air of authority that silenced conversations. He was a tall man with a commanding presence used to being obeyed without question. Behind him walked Mr. Samuel Okonkwo from Human Resources, clutching a folder already thick with papers. Dr. Kwame stopped outside the treatment room and peered through the glass. Is that the woman from the gate? He asked. Yes, Zainab replied. Nurse Hannah brought her in without authorization. Dr. Kwame's lips pressed into a thin line. Bring her to the conference room, he said. Now. When Hannah was summoned, her heart sank. She took one last look at Nancy, who seemed marginally more stable now, then followed the orderly down the corridor. With every step, the weight of what she had done pressed down on her. She straightened her shoulders anyway. The conference room was cold, both in temperature and atmosphere. Dr. Kwame sat at the head of the table. Mr. Okonkwo arranged his papers carefully. Zainab took a seat, her expression unreadable. Hannah Abiola, Dr. Kwame began, his voice calm but heavy with authority. Do you understand why you're here? Yes, sir, Hannah replied. Then explain yourself. Hannah took a deep breath. The patient collapsed outside the hospital. She was in critical condition. I made a decision to treat her. Without clearance, Mr. Okonkwo interjected. Yes, Hannah said, because waiting would have killed her. Dr. Kwame tapped his fingers on the table. You realize this hospital has protocols. I do, Hannah said, but protocols shouldn't cost lives. A silence followed. Zainab shifted in her seat. With all due respect, she said, if we allow this, we open the doors to everyone. We can't save the world. Hannah turned to her. No, she said softly, but we can save the person in front of us. Mr. Okonkwo scribbled something down. Dr. Kwame leaned back in his chair, studying Hannah as if seeing her clearly for the first time. This isn't over, he said. For now, return to your duties. We will review the footage. Hannah nodded. Thank you, sir. As she left the room, her legs felt unsteady. The relief was temporary, she knew that. Whatever happened next would not be kind. Back in the treatment room, Nancy opened her eyes again. This time she looked directly at Hannah. You stayed? Nancy whispered. Hannah smiled faintly. Of course I did. Nancy's fingers curled weakly around Hannah's hand. People don't stay, she said. They never do. Hannah swallowed hard. I'm here. Outside, unseen by both women, the hospital's cameras continued their silent watch. Every moment had been recorded, every choice preserved, and as the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the hospital grounds, the consequences of Hannah Abiola's compassion were already moving toward her slowly, deliberately, and without mercy. Night settled over the hospital with a deceptive calm. From the outside, the building glowed softly, its windows reflecting the last traces of daylight. Inside, however, tension tightened like a coiled wire. Hannah Abiola felt it with every step as she moved back and forth between patients. her thoughts never straying far from the small treatment room where Nancy Wanjala lay. Nancy had stabilized, but only barely. Her blood pressure remained low, her pulse fragile. The fluids helped, but Hannah knew they were buying time, not solving the problem. Nancy needed tests, scans, medication that required approval documentation, and most importantly, money. Hannah stood at the foot of Nancy's bed, reviewing the chart again and again, as if the answers might change if she looked hard enough. "You're still with me," Hannah said softly, brushing Nancy's hand with her thumb. "That's good." Nancy's eyes were closed, but her brow furrowed slightly as if she were struggling to stay anchored to the world. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. The oxygen hissed quietly, a steady reminder of how thin the line between life and death had become. From the corridor, voices drifted in. "Administration is reviewing it. Camera footage is clear. This could be serious." Hannah's stomach clenched. She had known from the moment she crossed that threshold that there would be consequences. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly they would arrive, or how alone she would feel waiting for them. Nurse Zainab Sadiq appeared in the doorway, her presence instantly changing the air in the room. "You should step out," Zainab said coolly. "This isn't your case anymore." Hannah turned to face her. "She's not stable." Zainab's gaze flicked briefly to Nancy, then back to Hannah. "And she's not registered. You've done enough." "Enough!" Hannah repeated, disbelief sharpening her voice. She could still die. Zainab sighed, as if exhausted by the argument. "People die every day, Hannah. You can't carry all of them." Hannah felt something inside her harden. "Maybe not," she said quietly. "But I can't drop the one I picked up." Zainab said nothing more. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step sounding like a verdict. Hours passed. The hospital's night rhythm took over. Lights dimmed in some wards, machines beeped steadily, staff moved with practiced efficiency. Hannah continued her duties, but her attention kept pulling her back to Nancy. Every time she passed the treatment room, she paused, checking vitals, adjusting blankets, whispering reassurance. Around midnight, everything changed. Nancy's breathing suddenly became labored, each inhale accompanied by a faint rattling sound. Her heart rate spiked, then dipped dangerously low. The monitor emitted a sharp, urgent tone that sliced through the quiet. Hannah was at her side in seconds. "Nancy," she said firmly, "stay with me. Look at me." Nancy's eyes fluttered open, panic flashing across her face. Her chest heaved, her lips trembling. "I can't," Nancy gasped. "Help me," Hannah called out into the corridor. "I need assistance now." A junior nurse rushed in, eyes wide. "What's happening?" "She's crashing," Hannah said, already reaching for medication. "I need epinephrine. Oxygen flow up." The junior nurse hesitated. "Do we have clearance?" Hannah didn't look at her. "Now." The girl swallowed and moved, hands shaking as she followed Hannah's instructions. Hannah's mind raced, calculating dosages, weighing risks. She knew exactly what she was doing and exactly how it would look to anyone reviewing the footage later. The medication went in. Nancy's body jerked slightly, then stilled. For a terrifying moment, the monitor flatlined. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered, pressing her fingers against Nancy's neck, willing a pulse to appear. "Not now, please." She began chest compressions, counting under her breath, sweat dripping down her temples. The room filled with urgency, footsteps shouted instructions, the harsh sound of alarms. "Come on," Hannah murmured. "Come back." Seconds stretched into an eternity, then a blip. The monitor flickered, then showed a faint but unmistakable rhythm. Hannah exhaled shakily, her arms burning, tears blurring her vision. Nancy's chest rose again, shallow but real. "She's back," the junior nurse whispered, awe and fear mingling in her voice. Hannah leaned back against the bed, her knees weak. Relief washed over her quickly, followed by dread. There was no denying it now. She had gone too far, used restricted medication, initiated emergency procedures without authorization. There would be no forgiveness for this. As Nancy's condition stabilized once more, Hannah noticed movement near the doorway. Dr. Kwame Adebayo stood there, his face, grave eyes fixed on the scene before him. Behind him, Mr. Samuel Okonkwo scribbled notes furiously. Dr. Kwame did not speak immediately. He watched Hannah remove her gloves, her hands trembling despite her effort to appear calm. "You acted again," he said finally. "Yes, sir," Hannah replied. Her voice was steady, though her heart was pounding, because she needed it. Mr. Okonkwo cleared his throat. "This is a serious breach." Hannah met their gaze. "She would be dead if I hadn't." Dr. Kwame's expression did not soften. "That may be," he said, but this hospital cannot function on individual judgment alone. Hannah nodded slowly. I understand. Do you? Mr. Okonkwo asked sharply. Because the footage shows repeated violations. Hannah closed her eyes briefly. Then let the footage show that I did my job. Silence fell over the room. Dr. Sia. Quame turned away first. We will convene in the morning, he said. For now, step aside. Hannah obeyed, moving out of the way as other staff took over. She lingered at the door, watching Nancy, who now lay still exhausted but alive. Nancy's eyes opened slightly, finding Hannah's. You? Stayed again? Nancy whispered. Hannah smiled faintly, tears threatening to spill. I promised. Nancy's fingers twitched weakly. Why, she asked. Why help me? Hannah hesitated. Then she said the truth. Because someone once told me that if you see pain and walk away, you lose a part of yourself. Nancy's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, she murmured. Hannah stepped out into the corridor, her legs trembling, the adrenaline drained from her body, leaving exhaustion in its wake. She leaned against the wall, staring at the floor. She knew what would happen next. By morning there would be meetings, decisions, papers signed. She would be judged not for saving a life, but for breaking rules. As the hospital settled back into its uneasy routine, the cameras continued their silent watch, recording everything. The desperate intervention, the unauthorized medication, the quiet words exchanged between two women brought together by circumstance. Far away in a different part of the city, Oluwafemi Oyekale slept peacefully, unaware that the name Nancy Wanjala was moving closer to him with every recorded second. And as dawn approached, Hannah Abiola remained standing in the corridor, knowing that when the sun rose again, nothing would be the same. Morning arrived without mercy. Sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, bright and unforgiving, exposing everything the night had tried to soften. Hannah Abiola stood outside the conference room, her uniform freshly pressed but her face drawn with exhaustion. She had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the monitor flatlining, heard the alarm, felt the burn in her arms as she pressed life back into Nancy Wanjala's fragile body. Now the price was due. Inside the conference room, voices murmured low, deliberate, rehearsed. Hannah recognized the cadence of authority decisions already made, outcomes already leaning in one direction. She took a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped inside when her name was called. Dr. Kwame Adebayo sat at the head of the long table, hands folded neatly. His expression was calm, almost detached, the way it often was when he needed to appear impartial. To his right sat Mr. Samuel Okonkwo, files stacked before him like silent witnesses. Nurse Zainab Sadiq occupied a seat near the middle, her posture rigid, eyes forward. Hannah Abiola, Dr. Kwame began, his voice measured. You were asked to be here so we can review your conduct over the past 24 hours. Hannah nodded. Yes, sir. Mr. Okonkwo adjusted his glasses and opened a file. The footage, he said, shows repeated violations of hospital protocol, unauthorized admission, use of restricted medication, initiating emergency procedures without clearance. He paused, letting each charge settle in the room. How do you plead? He asked. The question felt strange to Hannah, as if she were standing in a courtroom rather than a hospital meant to save lives. She clasped her hands together, steadying herself. I plead that I acted to prevent a death, she said. Zainab shifted slightly, a faint sigh escaping her lips. This is not about intention, Mr. Okonkwo replied. It's about procedure. Dr. Kwame leaned forward. Why didn't you escalate the situation through proper channels, he asked. I tried? Hannah answered. I was told to step aside. I was told to wait. Nancy didn't have time. Zainab spoke, then her voice cool and controlled. We cannot make exceptions every time someone feels moved, she said. If we did, we'd collapse within a week. Hannah turned to her. She wasn't an exception, she said quietly. She was a patient. Silence followed. Dr. Kwame tapped a pen against the table, thoughtful. Nurse Hannah, he said, do you understand the implications of what you've done? Yes, sir, Hannah replied. I understand I broke the rules, and yet you chose to do so anyway. Yes? Why? Hannah hesitated, not because she lacked an answer, but because the truth felt too simple for a room like this. Because leaving her outside felt like choosing comfort over conscience, she said. And I couldn't do that, Mr. Ister. Okonkwo scribbled something down, his expression unreadable. Dr. Kwame leaned back in his chair. The hospital operates on systems, he said. Those systems protect us from chaos. They also protect us from responsibility, Hannah said softly before she could stop herself. Zainab's eyes snapped toward her. Watch your tone. I'm sorry, Hannah said, lowering her gaze, but it's true. The room grew tense. Dr. Kwame exhaled slowly. You're asking us to excuse insubordination, he said, to reward it even. I'm not asking for a reward, Hannah replied. I'm asking you to look at the outcome. Mr. Okonkwo closed the file. The outcome, he said flatly, does not erase the violation. For a long moment no one spoke. Finally, Dr. Kwame stood. We will take a short recess, he announced. When we return, a decision will be made. Hannah was escorted back into the corridor. She sat on a bench staring at the floor tiles, tracing the cracks with her eyes. Her heart pounded, not with fear for herself, but with fear for Nancy. What would happen to her if Hannah was removed from the picture? Minutes stretched. Staff passed by, some glancing at Hannah with curiosity, others with pity, a few with open judgment. The junior nurse from the night shift paused briefly, offering a small apologetic smile before moving on. When Hannah was called back in, she already knew. Dr. Kwame's face was set, his posture formal. Mr. Okonkwo stood beside him, holding a single sheet of paper. Nurse Hannah Abiola. Dr. Kwame said, after careful consideration, the board has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately. The words landed like a physical blow. You will be compensated according to labor law. Mr. Okonkwo continued, his tone clinical. Your access badge will be collected. You are to leave the premises today. Hannah felt the room tilt slightly. She steadied herself against the table, refusing to sit. And Nancy, she asked quietly. Dr. Kwame's expression softened just a fraction. Her case will be reviewed. She will be transferred once stable. Hannah nodded slowly. It wasn't reassurance, but it was something. Zainab avoided her eyes. Hannah signed the paper without argument. There was no point fighting now. The decision had been sealed long before she entered the room. As she walked out of the conference room, a strange calm settled over her. The fear she had braced for did not come. Instead, there was clarity, sharp, painful, but honest. She went to the treatment room one last time. Nancy was awake, her eyes clearer than before, though her face was still pale. When she saw Hannah, her brow furrowed in concern. You look tired, Nancy said weakly. Hannah smiled, though her throat tightened. I wanted to say goodbye. Nancy's eyes widened. Goodbye. They won't let me work here anymore, Hannah said gently. Nancy struggled to sit up, alarm flashing across her face. Because of me, Hannah reached out, placing a hand on her arm. No, she said firmly. Because of their choices, and mine. Tears slipped from Nancy's eyes. I ruin things, she whispered. I always do. No. Hannah said, her voice breaking. You survived. That's not ruin. Nancy's fingers curled around Hannah's hand, gripping it with surprising strength. You saved me, she said. No one ever did that before. Hannah swallowed hard. Live, she said softly. That's all the thanks I need. A security guard appeared at the door, clearing his throat. Miss, it's time. Hannah nodded. She gently freed her hand from Nancy's grasp, stood and walked out without looking back. If she did, she wasn't sure she could leave. Her badge was taken, her locker emptied. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor, louder than she remembered. Outside, the sun was high again, just as it had been the day before. Life went on. Cars passed, people hurried by. Hannah stepped beyond the hospital gates, carrying nothing but a small bag and the weight of what she had lost. Behind her, the hospital doors closed, and somewhere inside, Nancy Wanjala lay breathing alive because one woman had refused to walk away. What Hannah did not know was that this ending was only the beginning. The footage, the reports, the names written on those papers, none of them were done traveling yet. And the consequences, both harsh and extraordinary, were already in motion. Hannah Abiola walked away from the hospital gates with slow, measured steps, as if moving too quickly might cause the ground beneath her to give way. The sun was still high, indifferent to what had just happened. Vendors called out prices from the roadside. Buses honked impatiently. Life flowed around her, untouched by the quiet collapse happening inside her chest. For years, the hospital had been the center of her world, her purpose, her identity. Now, with a single signature, it was gone. She did not cry. Not yet. Her room felt smaller than usual when she reached it. The thin mattress, the cracked mirror, the single chair by the window, all of it seemed to look back at her silently, asking what she would do next. Hannah placed her bag down carefully, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at her hands. They were steady. That surprised her. She had expected shaking panic, regret. Instead, what she felt was an aching emptiness mixed with something stubborn and quiet conviction. She thought of Nancy. Was she still breathing? Was anyone sitting with her now? Or had the system already begun to forget her the way it forgot so many others? The thought cut deeper than the loss of her job. That evening, Hannah returned to the hospital, but not as an employee. She stood across the street watching the building glow as night approached. She knew she wasn't supposed to be there, knew security would recognize her if she went too close. Still, she needed to know, she needed to see. After a long moment, she turned away and headed toward the small shelter run by Pastor Elijah Mwangi. It was a place she had volunteered at once or twice before, nothing official, just helping where she could on her days off. If Nancy had nowhere else to go, she might end up there. The shelter smelled of soap and warm food. A few people sat quietly, others slept on thin mats. Pastor Elijah looked up when Hannah entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Hannah," he said gently, "you look like someone who's been carrying too much." She forced a small smile. "Have you seen a woman named Nancy Wanjala?" she asked. "She's not well." Pastor Elijah frowned, thinking. "Not yet," he said, "but we hear about many before they arrive." "What happened?" Hannah hesitated, then told him everything. The words spilled out more easily than she expected: the gate, the collapse, the treatment, the meeting, the termination. When she finished, the room was quiet. Pastor Elijah nodded slowly. "You did the right thing," he said simply. Hannah looked down. "It doesn't feel right," she admitted. "It feels like I failed." "You didn't fail," he replied. "You paid a price." The distinction mattered more than Hannah realized. She inhaled shakily, the tension in her chest easing just a little. That same night inside the hospital, Nancy Wanjala stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a ward she did not belong to. She had been moved. No one explained much, only that she needed rest, that she would be transferred soon. The nurse on duty spoke kindly but briefly, her attention divided among many patients. Nancy felt the absence immediately. Hannah was gone. Nancy clutched the thin blanket tighter around herself, fear creeping in. She had learned over many years that kindness rarely stayed. It appeared suddenly, changed something, then vanished, leaving behind a deeper ache. She turned her head toward the door, half expecting Hannah to appear. She didn't. Across the ward, Nurse Zainab Sadiq observed Nancy from a distance. She told herself she was only doing her job, ensuring protocols were followed. Still, something about Nancy's stillness unsettled her. The woman didn't ask for much. She didn't complain. She simply lay there, eyes open, as if waiting for something or someone. Zainab looked away. She had won, or at least she had been proven right. Order had been restored. The rules had held. So why did it feel like something had been lost? The next morning, Hannah woke before dawn, the habit ingrained too deeply to break. For a moment, she reached for her uniform, then stopped. The realization hit her again, dull and heavy. She sat up slowly, pressing her palms against her eyes. There was no shift to rush to, no patience waiting, no schedule to follow, just silence. Hannah spent the morning walking the city, unsure where she was going. She passed clinics she couldn't afford to work at, private hospitals that would never hire someone with her record. Each step reminded her of what she no longer was. By midday, her savings already weighed on her mind. Rent, food, bills, compassion did not pay those. Still, when she closed her eyes, she saw Nancy's face, not as she had been on the concrete, but as she was when she whispered "thank you." That mattered. Inside the hospital, a meeting took place that Hannah did not know about. Dr. Kwame Adebayo sat across from a visitor he had not expected. The man was well-dressed, calm, his presence commanding without being loud. He introduced himself simply. "Oluwafemi Oyekale," he said. "I'm here regarding a patient named Nancy Wanjala." Dr. Kwame's brow furrowed slightly. "And your connection to her?" Oluwafemi paused, his expression unreadable. "I believe," he said carefully, "that she once saved my mother's life." The room fell silent. Dr. Kwame felt a flicker of unease. He had reviewed many files, seen many names, but something in Oluwafemi's voice suggested this was not a casual inquiry. "I would like to see the footage," Oluwafemi continued. "All of it." Back in her room, unaware of the shift beginning far above her, Hannah sat by the window as afternoon light filtered in. She replayed every decision, every word spoken in that conference room. She wondered if she would make the same choice again. The answer came without hesitation. Yes. Her phone buzzed, suddenly startling her. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. For a moment she considered letting it ring. Then she answered. Hello? There was a brief pause on the other end. Then a calm, measured voice spoke. Is this Hannah Abiola? Yes, Hannah replied, her heart quickening. Who is this? My name is Oluwafemi Oyekale, the voice said. I believe we need to talk about Nancy Wanjala. Hannah's breath caught. The world which had seemed so small and closed only moments ago suddenly felt very wide. Hannah Abiola held the phone to her ear long after the call ended. Oluwafemi Oyekale had not said much. He hadn't explained who he really was or why Nancy Wanjala mattered so deeply to him. He had only asked one thing, where Hannah was and whether they could meet in person. Today, he had added, if possible. Hannah agreed before she fully understood why. Now she sat on the edge of her bed, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the room. Her heart beat faster than it had during the meeting that ended her career. This felt different, uncertain, heavy with meaning. An hour later, a black car pulled up outside her building, clean, quiet, unmistakably expensive. Hannah hesitated before stepping out. She wore a simple dress, the kind she saved for church, her hair pulled back neatly. She told herself appearance didn't matter. Still, she felt the familiar pinch of self-awareness that came with standing too close to wealth. The driver opened the door. Inside, Oluwafemi Oyekale waited. He was younger than Hannah expected, mid-40s perhaps, with calm eyes and a presence that filled the space without demanding it. He stood when she approached, offering a respectful nod. Thank you for coming, he said. Hannah returned the nod, cautious. You asked to see me? Yes, Oluwafemi replied. Please sit. The car moved smoothly through the city, passing crowded streets and quiet neighborhoods alike. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Hannah studied him from the corner of her eye, noting the restraint in his posture, the way he seemed to be holding something back. You wanted to talk about Nancy, Hannah said finally. Oluwafemi nodded. I reviewed the footage. Hannah's stomach tightened. Then you know why I was fired. I do, he said. And I know what you did. She waited for judgment. It didn't come. Instead, Oluwafemi looked out the window, his voice lowering. When I was a boy, my mother fell ill suddenly. We were traveling. There was an accident on the road, nothing dramatic, just enough to delay us. She collapsed not far from a bus park. Hannah listened, her breath shallow. No hospital would take her without payment, he continued. She was already losing consciousness. People passed by, some looked, most didn't stop. He turned to Hannah then. A woman did. Hannah's heart began to race. She was poor, Oluwafemi said. A vegetable seller, I later learned. She gave up her stall for the day, used her own money to buy water, to call for help, to sit with my mother until an ambulance arrived. He paused, swallowing. My mother survived. That woman disappeared before we could thank her. Hannah whispered the name without meaning to. Nancy. Yes, Oluwafemi said quietly. Nancy Wanjala. The city seemed to blur outside the window. Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. She never told me that, Hannah said. She rarely speaks of it, Oluwafemi replied. I spent years searching. Names fade, faces change. It wasn't until this week that I finally found her. He exhaled slowly. And when I did, I learned she had been left to die outside a hospital. Hannah clenched her hands in her lap. She almost did, she said. If I hadn't, you did. Oluwafemi interrupted gently. That's why I'm here. The car stopped in front of a quiet building, a private medical facility, discreet and immaculate. Oluwafemi stepped out first, gesturing for Hannah to follow. Nancy is here, he said. She's stable, receiving the care she should have had all along. Relief washed over Hannah so suddenly that her knees weakened. She pressed a hand to her chest, steadying herself. Thank you, she whispered. Oluwafemi studied her carefully. You lost your job because of her, he said. Do you regret it? Hannah didn't hesitate. No, not even now, he asked, knowing what it cost you. Especially now, she replied. If I had walked away, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. Oluwafemi nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. Inside, Nancy lay propped up on crisp white sheets, color returning slowly to her face. When she saw Hannah, her eyes widened, then filled with tears. You came, Nancy said. Hannah crossed the room in 2 quick steps, taking her hand. Of course I did. Nancy squeezed her fingers weakly. I thought they chased you away. They did, Hannah said softly, but it doesn't mean I stopped caring. Nancy turned her gaze toward Oluwafemi, confusion clouding her expression. Who is this man? Oluwafemi stepped forward, lowering himself slightly to meet her eye level. "I'm the son of the woman you saved," he said. "Many years ago." Recognition flickered in Nancy's eyes. Slowly, painfully, it settled. "The woman at the bus park," Nancy whispered. "Yes," Oluwafemi said. "My mother." Nancy closed her eyes, tears slipping free. "I didn't think she lived." "She did," he said. "Because of you." Silence filled the room, thick with emotion. For the first time in years, Nancy smiled, a small, fragile thing, but real. "Then my life wasn't wasted," she murmured. Hannah felt something break open inside her. Later, as evening approached, Oluwafemi walked Hannah back to the car. "There's more you should know," he said. She looked at him, wary but attentive. "The hospital," he continued, "they acted according to their system, but that system is broken." Hannah nodded. "I know. I'm one of their largest donors," Oluwafemi said calmly. The words landed with quiet force. Hannah stopped walking. What I didn't go there as a donor," he clarified. "I went as a son looking for the woman who saved his mother. What I found was something else." He met her gaze. "I intend to address it." Hannah searched his face, trying to read what this meant. "And me?" she asked. Oluwafemi smiled faintly. "You will not be forgotten," he said. "Not by me." As the car pulled away, Hannah watched the building fade behind them. For the first time since she was fired, the future did not feel like a closed door. It felt like a turning point. And somewhere inside the hospital that had cast her out, the consequences of compassion were beginning to echo louder and wider than anyone had expected. The following morning, the hospital woke to a different kind of tension. It wasn't loud. There were no raised voices in the corridors, no emergency alarms. Instead, it moved quietly through emails sent before dawn, through whispered conversations at the nurses' station, through the uneasy looks exchanged between administrators who sensed something was about to break. Dr. Kwame Adebayo arrived early as he always did. He liked control, liked being ahead of problems before they fully formed. That morning, however, control slipped the moment he saw the message marked urgent waiting in his inbox, a formal notice, a request for a full internal review, signed by Oluwafemi Oyekale. Dr. Kwame felt a slow tightening in his chest. He leaned back in his chair, reading the email again, hoping he had misunderstood. He hadn't. Oluwafemi Oyekale was not just a donor. He was the donor. The hospital's newest wing, the dialysis unit, several outreach programs, none of them existed without his money. And now the man was asking questions, detailed ones. Dr. Kwame summoned Mr. Samuel Okonkwo immediately. "This is about that patient," Dr. Kwame said once the door closed. "Nancy Wanjala." Mr. Okonkwo adjusted his tie, already uneasy. "The homeless woman?" "Yes," Dr. Kwame replied. "And the nurse." They didn't say Hannah Abiola's name out loud at first, saying it felt dangerous, as if naming her might pull the past back into the room. "We followed protocol," Mr. Okonkwo said quickly. "The termination was clean." "Clean doesn't mean wise," Dr. Kwame muttered. By mid-morning, Oluwafemi arrived. He did not announce himself with arrogance or anger. He walked into the hospital, quietly dressed simply, his expression calm but unreadable. People stepped aside instinctively, not because they recognized him immediately, but because authority had a way of making space. "Dr. Arthur." Kwame met him at the entrance, forcing a polite smile. "Mr. Oyekale," he said. "We weren't expecting you so soon." "I imagine not," Oluwafemi replied evenly. "Let's talk." They moved into the conference room, the same room where Hannah Abiola had stood alone days earlier. Oluwafemi took a seat at the head of the table without being invited. "I've reviewed the footage," he began. "All of it." Dr. Kwame nodded cautiously. "As have we." And yet Oluwafemi continued, "You fired the nurse who saved a woman's life." Silence fell. Nurse Zainab Sadiq sat stiffly, her hands clasped together. She had been called into the meeting without explanation. Now, as Oluwafemi's eyes swept across the room, something cold settled in her stomach. "Our decision was based on policy," Mr. Okonkwo said carefully. "Hospitals cannot operate on emotion." "No," Oluwafemi replied. "But they also cannot operate without humanity." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, doctor, how many patients like Nancy Wanjala are turned away each month?" Dr. Kwame hesitated. "We don't have exact numbers." "Then I suggest you find them," Oluwafemi said. Because Nancy was not an isolated incident. She was a symptom. Zainab felt heat rise to her face. With respect, she said, "Rules exist to protect resources. If we let everyone," in Oluwafemi's gaze snapped to her, "everyone," he repeated, Or just those who cannot pay? Zainab fell silent. You know what troubles me most, Oluwafemi continued. It isn't that you have rules. It's that when someone finally acted with courage, you punished her. Dr. Kwame cleared his throat. Nurse Hannah acted without authorization. That cannot be ignored. Authorization, Oluwafemi said softly. Interesting word. He stood walking slowly toward the window, looking out at the city beyond the hospital walls. My mother collapsed on a roadside many years ago, he said. Authorization did not save her. A woman did. The room was still. Nancy Wanjala gave up her livelihood that day, he continued. And years later, when she needed help, your system left her on concrete. Dr. Kwame swallowed. What is it you want, Mr. Oyakale? Oluwafemi turned back to face them. Accountability, he said. And change. By the time the meeting ended, nothing was officially decided, but everything had shifted. Word spread quickly. Staff whispered about donors and investigations. Some spoke Hannah Abiola's name with newfound respect. Others avoided it entirely, afraid of where the conversation might lead. Nurse Zainab returned to her station shaken. She told herself she had done nothing wrong. She had followed procedure. She had protected the hospital. And yet every time she remembered Nancy lying on that concrete, her certainty wavered. That afternoon, Hannah sat at the private facility beside Nancy, unaware of the storm building behind her. Nancy was stronger now. She could sit up on her own, eat slowly, speak in full sentences. She told Hannah pieces of her life, about the fire that destroyed her stall, about sleeping near the bus park, about learning how invisible a person could become. I stopped expecting help, Nancy said quietly. It hurts less that way. Hannah squeezed her hand. You shouldn't have had to. Nancy studied her. They punished you for helping me. They punished me for breaking rules, Hannah replied gently. Nancy shook her head. No, they punished you for seeing me. The words stayed with Hannah long after she left that evening. That night, Oluwafemi sat alone in his study reviewing reports, footage statements. He paused, often replaying the moment Hannah stepped past the guard, the moment she lifted Nancy with trembling arms, the moment she chose action over safety. He thought of his mother's voice, long gone but still clear in his memory. Kindness is never wasted, she used to say. It just travels. The next morning, Hannah's phone rang again. This time it wasn't Oluwafemi. It was the hospital. She stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Miss Abiola. Okonkwo's voice said stiffly, We would like you to come in for a discussion. Hannah closed her eyes. About what she asked, there have been developments, he replied. Hannah thought of Nancy, of the hospital gates, of the cost of compassion. I'll be there, she said. As she hung up, she didn't know whether she was walking back into redemption or another trial, but she knew one thing for certain. This story was no longer just hers. Hannah Abiola stood outside the hospital gates again, her heart pounding harder than it had the day she was fired. The building looked the same, clean glass guarded doors, people moving in and out with purpose. Yet for Hannah, everything about it felt altered. She was no longer part of the flow. She was an interruption. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, carrying the familiar scent of disinfectant. Heads turned as she walked past the reception desk. Some staff recognized her immediately. A few offered quick, awkward smiles. Others looked away, pretending not to see her at all. Mr. Samuel Okonkwo was waiting near the administrative wing. He greeted her with a nod that was polite, but tense. Thank you for coming, he said. Please, this way. As they walked, Hannah noticed something unusual. Conversations stopped when they passed. Whispers followed. Her name floated behind her like a shadow she couldn't shake. In the conference room, Dr. Kwame Adebayo sat at the table, his posture stiff. Nurse Zainab Sadiq occupied a chair near the far end, her face carefully composed. And at the head of the table, calm, unbothered, unmistakably in control, sat Oluwafemi Oyakale. Hannah froze for a brief moment. He met her eyes and offered a small, reassuring nod. Please, Dr. Kwame said, gesturing to an empty seat. Sit. Hannah obeyed, her palms damp against the smooth surface of the table. This meeting, Dr. Kwame began, has been called to review recent concerns regarding hospital protocol, staff conduct, and patient care. Hannah said nothing. Oluwafemi leaned forward slightly. And to revisit a decision that was made too quickly, he added. Mr. Okonkwo cleared his throat. Mr. Oyakale has raised serious questions, he said, about our handling of the Nancy Wanjala case. Zainab shifted in her seat. We followed procedure, she said. The nurse acted independently. Hannah turned toward her, surprised by the sharpness in Zainab's voice. It sounded defensive now, less certain than before. Oluwafemi spoke calmly. Procedure is not the issue, he said. Perspective is. He tapped a remote on the table. The screen at the end of the room flickered to life. Footage appeared. Hannah felt her chest tighten as she watched herself on the screen, kneeling on concrete, pleading with the guard, lifting Nancy with shaking arms. The room was silent, except for the muted sounds of the recording. The footage moved on. The treatment room. The IV. The moment Nancy crashed. Hannah's hands pressing down, counting, refusing to stop. When the screen went dark again, no one spoke for several seconds. This, Oluwafemi said quietly, is what courage looks like. Dr. Kwame exhaled slowly. She violated multiple rules. Yes, Oluwafemi replied, and she saved a life. Mr. Okonkwo shifted uncomfortably. We cannot allow precedent. Precedent already exists, Oluwafemi interrupted. Every time someone is turned away because they cannot pay. He turned to Hannah then. Tell them, he said gently, why you did it. Hannah swallowed her throat tight. Because I saw a woman dying, she said, and because I knew that if I walked away I would never forgive myself. Her voice steadied as she continued. I didn't think about donors, or cameras, or consequences. I thought about what it meant to be a nurse. Silence settled over the room again, heavier this time. Zainab spoke softly, almost reluctantly. If everyone did that, the hospital would collapse. Oluwafemi turned to her. If no one ever does, he replied, then the hospital loses its soul. Dr. Kwame rubbed his temples. What exactly are you asking for? He asked. Oluwafemi folded his hands. First, he said, the termination of Nurse Hannah Abiola must be formally reversed, with a public acknowledgement of error. Hannah's breath caught. Second, he continued, I want an immediate review of admission policies for emergency cases, especially for patients without means. Mr. Okonkwo hesitated. That would require funding. Oluwafemi nodded, which I am prepared to provide. The words fell like thunder. And third, Oluwafemi added, those who acted in bad faith, those who prioritized appearances over human life will be held accountable. Zainab stiffened. Are you accusing us of cruelty? I'm accusing you of convenience, Oluwafemi replied calmly. Cruelty often hides behind it. Dr. Kwame leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had built his career on balance rules, donor systems, but now the imbalance was undeniable. I will not pretend this is easy, he said finally, but I cannot deny what the footage shows. He turned to Hannah. Nurse Abiola, we acted too quickly. Hannah's hands trembled slightly. Your dismissal, Dr. Kwame continued, will be reviewed. Oluwafemi raised an eyebrow. Reviewed, he repeated. Dr. Kwame met his gaze. Reversed, he corrected himself. A breath Hannah didn't realize she was holding escaped her lungs. And Dr. Kwame added a formal apology will be issued. The meeting ended quietly. No shouting, no celebration, just the slow, heavy shift of something long overdue. As Hannah stepped out of the conference room, staff lined the corridor, some openly watching, others pretending to be busy. The junior nurse from the night shift caught Hannah's eye and smiled, relief shining through. Later that afternoon, Hannah returned to Nancy's room. Nancy was sitting up stronger now, a small bowl of soup in her hands. When she saw Hannah, her face lit up. They told me, Nancy said, about the meeting. Hannah sat beside her. Things are changing, she said carefully. Nancy nodded. I prayed for that, she said. For you. Hannah smiled, tears threatening to fall. You don't have to pray for me anymore, she said softly. Just get better. Outside the room, Oluwafemi watched for a moment unseen. He felt something unfamiliar but welcome peace. His mother's voice echoed again in his memory. Kindness travels. And now at last it was returning home. The official apology came the next morning. It arrived not as a whisper, but as a statement circulated through internal channels, printed and posted on notice boards, read aloud during shift briefings. The hospital acknowledged an error in judgment. It affirmed a renewed commitment to emergency care regardless of financial status. And it named Hannah Abiola not as a rule breaker, but as a nurse whose actions reflected the core values the institution claimed to uphold. For Hannah, reading the words felt unreal. She stood at the edge of the ward holding the paper with both hands, her eyes scanning the lines again and again as if the meaning might change. Around her, the hospital moved on, stretchers rolled by, phones rang. Footsteps echoed, but something fundamental had shifted. Her name, once spoken with caution, was now spoken with a different tone. Respect. Not everyone welcomed it. Nurse Zainab Sadiq read the same notice with a tight jaw. She folded the paper carefully and placed it into her bag, her movements precise. No one addressed her directly, but she felt the glances, the quiet recalibration of how people saw her. During the mid-morning briefing, Dr. Kwame Adebayo stood straighter than usual. "This is not about assigning blame," he said, his voice steady. "It is about learning. We are revising emergency intake procedures effective immediately." A murmur rippled through the room, and he continued, "Nurse Hannah Abiola will resume her duties." Hannah felt the room turn toward her. She nodded once, grateful but composed. She had learned in the past few days how fragile moments like this could be. Celebration could wait, work could not. Her first stop was Nancy's room. Nancy Wanjala looked stronger color in her cheeks, clarity in her eyes. When Hannah entered, Nancy smiled slowly, the kind of smile built from relief rather than joy. "They told me you're back," Nancy said. Hannah pulled a chair closer. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm here." Nancy exhaled a long breath she seemed to have been holding for days. "Then I can rest," she said. "I was afraid. When people like you disappear, it means the world hasn't changed." Hannah reached for her hand. "It's changing," she said, slowly. Nancy studied her. "And you? Are you all right?" Hannah considered the question. She thought of the fear, the loss, the quiet nights, wondering how to pay rent, the weight of standing alone in a conference room. Then she thought of the life she had saved, the doors that had opened the way compassion had traveled farther than she ever imagined. "I will be," she said. That afternoon, Oluwafemi Oyakale asked Hannah to join him for a short walk on the hospital grounds. They moved along the shaded path between buildings where staff sometimes took quick breaks. The air was warm, but not oppressive. It felt like a pause. "You handled this with grace," Oluwafemi said after a moment. Hannah smiled faintly. "I didn't feel graceful." "Grace doesn't require comfort," he replied. "Only conviction." They stopped near a bench overlooking the city. Oluwafemi rested his hands lightly on the railing. "My mother believed institutions should serve people," he said, "not the other way around." Hannah nodded. "I think many people forget that. That's why systems need reminders," he said, "and people like you." She looked at him, curiosity surfacing. "What happens now?" Oluwafemi's gaze remained on the horizon. "Now we make the changes permanent." He explained his plan carefully, not as an announcement, but as an invitation. A fund dedicated to emergency care for the uninsured, a training program centered on ethical decision-making, partnerships with shelters and outreach clinics so fewer people would reach a hospital gate already collapsing. "I don't want this to be about one nurse or one patient," he said. "I want it to be about the next 100 who never make the news." Hannah listened, her mind racing, not with fear this time, but with possibility. "I can help," she said finally. "If you want." Oluwafemi turned to her, surprised but pleased. "I was hoping you'd say that." As the days passed, the hospital adjusted awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. Staff training sessions filled rooms once used for administrative meetings. Intake protocols changed. The security guards received new instructions, and with them, new authority to act quickly rather than refuse. Some resisted. Change always carried discomfort. Others embraced it. The junior nurse who had hesitated during Nancy's crisis approached Hannah one evening. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for showing me what courage looks like." Hannah squeezed her shoulder. "You already had it," she said. "You just needed permission." Nancy's recovery progressed steadily. When the day came for her discharge, Hannah walked with her to the entrance, not to the gate where she had once collapsed, but through the front doors. A small crowd had gathered, staff, volunteers, even a few patients who had heard her story. Nancy stood taller than she had in years, dressed in clean clothes provided by the shelter. She turned to Hannah, eyes shining. "I don't know where I'm going yet," she said. "But I know I'm not alone." "You never were," Hannah replied. Nancy hugged her, holding on longer than expected. When she pulled away, she looked toward Oluwafemi, who stood nearby. "Your mother would be proud," Nancy said simply. Oluwafemi bowed his head. "So am I." That evening, as the sun dipped low, Hannah finished her shift and stepped outside. The air felt lighter. The city hummed with its usual noise, but something within her had quieted. She had learned that doing the right thing could cost you everything. She had also learned that sometimes it gives back more than you ever imagined. And as she walked home, tired but steady, Hannah Abiola knew this story was still unfolding, not as a miracle, but as a promise. The city breathed differently after Nancy Wanjala left the hospital. Hannah Abiola noticed it in small ways. The security guard at the gate no longer looked away when someone approached without paperwork. Nurses paused longer at bedsides. Doctors asked questions that went beyond charts and numbers. None of it was perfect, none of it was dramatic, but it was real. And for Hannah, that mattered more. Nancy moved into the shelter run by Pastor Elijah Mwangi, where sunlight filtered through open windows and meals arrived with quiet consistency. Each afternoon, Hannah visited after her shift, sometimes bringing fruit, sometimes just sitting beside Nancy while the room filled with murmurs and laughter from others finding their footing again. "You should rest," Nancy would tell her, smiling. "You're still trying to save everyone." Hannah would smile back. "I'm learning how to save myself too." One evening, as the shelter settled into calm, Nancy asked a question she had been carrying for days. "Why did you choose nursing?" she asked. Hannah considered the ceiling, the way the fan turned slowly above them. "My mother fell sick when I was young," she said. "We didn't have much. There were days I thought she wouldn't make it. A nurse stayed with us long after her shift ended. She didn't do anything extraordinary. She just didn't leave." Nancy nodded. "Sometimes that's all people need." The following week, Hannah received an invitation, not a summons. Not a request, but an invitation. Oluwafemi Oyakale asked her to attend a small planning meeting outside the hospital, somewhere neutral, somewhere quiet. They met in a modest office overlooking a busy street. The room held a long table, a whiteboard, and nothing that suggested power. That Hannah realized was deliberate. "We'll keep this simple," Oluwafemi said as they sat. "No press, no announcements yet." Hannah nodded. "I prefer it that way." They spoke about the fund first, how it would work, how cases would be evaluated, how dignity would remain central. Oluwafemi listened more than he spoke, occasionally asking questions that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "What happens when the fund runs low?" he asked. "Then we make choices," Hannah replied, "but never based on worth, only on urgency." He smiled faintly. "My mother would have liked you." The work moved quickly. Partnerships formed with shelters and community clinics. Volunteers signed up. Training materials were drafted and redrafted. Hannah found herself stepping into a role she hadn't planned, bridging worlds, translating compassion into structure. Not everyone approved. Within the hospital, resistance simmered beneath the surface. Some staff complained quietly that Hannah had been rewarded for disobedience. Others worried that donors would dictate care. A few feared that the old protections, the ones that kept blame at a distance, were slipping away. Nurse Zainab Sadiq watched all of it unfold with a tight knot in her chest. She had avoided Hannah since the meeting, unsure of what to say. The apology posted on the notice board still burned in her mind, not because it existed, but because it named what she had tried not to see. One afternoon, she found Hannah alone in the supply room checking inventory. "Do you have a moment?" Zainab asked. Hannah looked up, surprised. "Of course." Zainab hesitated, then spoke. "I followed rules because I thought they made me good at my job." "They can," Hannah said gently. "And when you broke them," Zainab continued, "I felt exposed, like if you were right, then I had been wrong for a long time." Hannah set the clipboard down. "We're both here to care for people," she said. "Sometimes we just forget why." Zainab nodded slowly. "I don't know how to change overnight." "You don't have to," Hannah replied. "Just don't look away." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't closure, but it was a beginning. At the shelter, Nancy grew stronger with each passing day. She volunteered in the kitchen, folded blankets, listened to stories that mirrored her own. One evening, she confessed something to Hannah as they walked back from the market. "I was afraid to live," Nancy said quietly. "When you've lost everything, surviving feels like tempting fate." Hannah squeezed her arm. "Living is not a punishment," she said. "It's a responsibility to yourself." Nancy smiled, thoughtful. "Then I will try to be responsible." The first emergency covered by the new fund came sooner than expected, a young man injured at a construction site. No identification, no money, bleeding heavily. This time there was no hesitation. He was admitted, treated, stabilized. When Hannah saw him later conscious and grateful, something loosened inside her chest. This is how it starts, she thought, not with speeches, with choices. A week later, Oluwafemi invited Hannah to visit his mother's grave. It was a quiet place shaded by old trees far from the noise of the city. He stood in silence for a long moment before speaking. She believed in ordinary goodness, he said, in people who stay. Hannah placed a small bouquet on the stone. She raised someone who did, she replied. As they walked away, Oluwafemi asked a question he had been holding back. What do you want now? Hannah didn't answer immediately. She thought of the hospital gate, the concrete, the choice that changed everything. She thought of Nancy's laughter at the shelter, of Zainab's uncertain courage, of a system bending, not breaking toward mercy. I want to keep choosing, she said, even when it's hard. Oluwafemi nodded. Then we're aligned. That night, Hannah returned home tired but steady. She wrote in a small notebook she kept by her bed. Names, ideas, reminders of why the work mattered. At the top of the page, she wrote one sentence: kindness is not an exception. She closed the notebook and turned off the light. Outside, the city hummed imperfect, alive, waiting. And in that waiting, Hannah Abiola felt ready for whatever came next. Change rarely announces itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly through revised memos, altered routines, uncomfortable conversations that people would rather avoid. For Hannah Abiola, the change became visible the morning she arrived at the hospital and saw a line at the gate move differently than before. A woman without shoes was ushered inside for assessment. A young man with a bleeding arm was seated and given water before anyone asked for documents. The guard nodded at Hannah as she passed his eyes, carrying something close to pride. Inside, however, the tension had not vanished. It had simply shifted. Dr. Kwame Adebayo felt it keenly. Every decision now seemed heavier, watched from multiple directions by staff, by donors, by a growing sense of moral accountability he could no longer sidestep. Meetings stretched longer, emails multiplied, and in the quiet moments between tasks he wondered whether he had led with fear for too long. The board convened that afternoon. This time it wasn't routine. Oluwafemi Oyakale joined via video call, his image steady on the screen. He listened more than he spoke, letting reports unfold: numbers of emergency admissions, funding allocations, staff feedback. When the discussion turned to liability, he raised a hand. Liability is not a shield, he said calmly. It's a responsibility. The room fell silent. Dr. Kwame cleared his throat. We've identified lapses in judgment, he said, particularly in how emergency discretion was exercised. Hannah sat near the back, invited but not required to speak. She watched faces, some guarded, some thoughtful, a few openly resistant. Nurse Zainab Sadiq was among them. When asked to comment, Zainab stood slowly. I enforced rules, she said, but I failed to recognize urgency. I mistook control for care. It was not a full confession. It was not an apology. But it was the first time she had said it aloud. Oluwafemi nodded once. Acknowledgement is a start, he said. Consistency must follow. The board voted to formalize the emergency fund, integrate ethical discretion training into staff onboarding, and create a small review committee. One that included frontline workers, not just administrators. Hannah felt a tightness in her chest loosen. Later that day, she found Zainab standing alone near the stairwell, staring out at the city. Thank you, Hannah said quietly. Zainab looked at her surprised. For what? For speaking, Hannah replied. It wasn't easy. Zainab exhaled. No, it wasn't. She hesitated. I don't expect forgiveness. Hannah shook her head. I'm not offering absolution. I'm offering space. Zainab nodded, absorbing the words. Then I'll try to use it well. At the shelter, Nancy Wanjala prepared for another small step forward, an interview with a cooperative market that offered shared stalls to women restarting their livelihoods. Hannah sat beside her as Nancy practiced answers, her voice steady but cautious. What if they say no? Nancy asked. Then we try somewhere else, Hannah replied. One door closing doesn't define you. Nancy smiled, nerves softening. You say that like you believe it. I learned it the hard way, Hannah said gently. The interview went better than expected. Nancy returned, beaming, clutching a piece of paper with dates and instructions. It wasn't a promise, but it was a beginning. That evening, as rain clouds gathered without releasing a drop, Hannah received a message from Oluwafemi. Tomorrow, early, there's something you should see. They met at the hospital before sunrise. The corridors were quiet, the city still yawning awake. Oluwafemi led Hannah to a small room near the old wing, unused for years, filled with dust and forgotten equipment. This will become the emergency coordination office, he said, close to the entrance. Decisions made here will be fast and human. Hannah ran her fingers along the windowsill, imagining desks, charts, voices working together. You're changing the architecture, she said. Systems shape behavior, Oluwafemi replied. So do rooms. They walked the grounds as the sun rose. Oluwafemi spoke of long-term plans, mobile clinics, data transparency, community training. Hannah listened, offering practical insights from the floor, what failed, what slowed care, where fear crept in. You see the cracks, he said. I've stood in them, she replied. Word spread beyond the hospital. Local clinics reached out. Shelter coordinators asked for guidance. A small radio program invited Hannah to speak not about heroism, but about choosing presence over policy when lives hung in the balance. She declined the spotlight, but agreed to share resources. Stories inspire, she told the host. Structures sustain. Within the hospital, attitudes continued to shift. The junior nurse who once hesitated now moved with quiet confidence. A doctor requested ethics training for his unit. Even the guards spoke differently, less scripted, more attentive. None of it erased the past, but it redirected the future. One afternoon, Dr. Kwam asked Hannah to walk with him. I won't pretend this has been easy, he said. I built my career on caution. Hannah listened. I see now that caution can become avoidance, he continued, and avoidance becomes harm. Hannah stopped. Change doesn't require perfection, she said, only honesty. Dr. Kwame nodded. Then I'll start there. At the shelter, Nancy took her first shift at the cooperative market. She returned, tired hands, sore, spirit bright. I sold out, she said, laughing. By noon, Hannah laughed with her, the sound light and free. That night, Hannah wrote again in her notebook. Beneath the earlier line, she added another systems can learn. As weeks passed, the hospital's reputation changed not through press releases, but through word of mouth. People came earlier. Fewer collapsed at the gate. More left with treatment plans and follow-up. There were setbacks, mistakes, arguments. But there was movement, and in that movement, Hannah felt something settle, a sense that her choice on that concrete had rippled outward, shaping lives she would never meet. On a quiet evening, as the city lights flickered on, Oluwafemi called. You didn't just help my mother, he said. You helped me keep my promise to her. Hannah smiled softly. Promises are easier when we keep them together. As the call ended, Hannah looked out at the city alive, flawed, hopeful. Change hadn't arrived with trumpets. It had arrived with people who stayed. By the time the first mobile clinic rolled into the neighborhood near the old bus park, the city had already begun to whisper. Not loudly, not with headlines or cameras, just enough for people to notice that something was different. The van was modest white paint, blue lettering, no grand logos, but to the crowd that gathered beneath the trees, it might as well have been a miracle. Mothers with tired eyes, elderly men leaning on canes, young workers nursing untreated injuries, all watched as the doors opened and staff stepped out with calm efficiency. Hannah Abiola stood near the back clipboard tucked under her arm, observing rather than directing. She had learned that real change didn't require a spotlight. It required presence. First priority is triage, she said to the team quietly. Then referrals. The guard who once shook his head at her now helped guide people into a loose line, his voice firm but kind. A nurse checked blood pressure. A doctor listened. Really listened to complaints that had been ignored for years. From a distance, Nancy Wanjala watched with something close to disbelief. She had finished her shift at the cooperative market early that day, her hands still smelling faintly of tomatoes and onions. When she heard about the clinic, she came without knowing why, only that it felt connected to a life she had almost lost. Hannah noticed her standing there and waved. Nancy approached slowly, eyes scanning the scene. You built this, she asked. Hannah shook her head. We did. Nancy nodded, absorbing the truth of it. People are being helped, she said, before they fall. That's the point, Hannah replied. As the afternoon wore on, stories emerged, quiet, personal, heavy. A man who had been rationing insulin, a woman who hadn't slept from pain in months, a boy whose cough had gone untreated until it sounded like tearing cloth. Each case reminded Hannah of the day at the hospital gate, not as a wound, but as a compass. Later, as the van prepared to leave, Oluwafemi Oyakali arrived, quietly observing without interrupting. He stood beside Hannah, watching the final patients receive referrals. "You were right," he said softly. "About structures." Hannah smiled faintly. "They don't replace kindness," she said. "They protect it." He nodded. "And people like you remind them why." At the hospital, the changes had begun to settle into routine. The emergency coordination office near the entrance hummed with activity calls, assessments, decisions made quickly and documented clearly. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but fewer people were turned away, fewer names disappeared into silence. Dr. Kwame Adebayo found himself walking the wards more often, stopping to ask questions he once avoided. When he saw Hannah, he greeted her with a nod that carried both respect and responsibility. "I wanted to tell you," he said one afternoon, "the board approved the final policy revisions." Hannah met his gaze. "Good," she said. "Then we keep going." Nurse Zainab Sadiq took a slower path. She volunteered for ethics training sessions, listening more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was careful, less certain, more honest. One evening, she approached Hannah near the lockers. "I still believe in rules," Zainab said. "So do I," Hannah replied. "But I'm learning when to bend." Zainab continued, "And when not to look away." Hannah nodded. That's all anyone can ask. At the shelter, Nancy's life continued to rebuild itself in small, meaningful ways. She rented a shared room near the market. She learned to budget again. She laughed more easily. The night terrors came less often. One evening, as they sat outside watching the city lights, Nancy turned to Hannah. "I used to think surviving was the hardest part," she said. "But living, that's harder." Hannah smiled gently. "It is," she agreed. "But you're doing it," Nancy hesitated. "I want to help," she said, "like you did." Hannah considered her. "You already are," she said, "by staying, by starting again." The next week, Nancy began volunteering at the shelter, listening to newcomers, sharing what she had learned, reminding them that invisibility wasn't permanent. Word traveled. A small donation box appeared at the shelter, then another. A clinic in a neighboring district asked for guidance. The fund expanded not explosively, but steadily. One afternoon, Hannah received an envelope at the hospital, no return address, just her name written carefully. Inside was a note and a modest amount of money. "You treated my sister when no one else would. I don't know how to repay you. Please use this for the next person." Hannah folded the note hard, heavy and full all at once. She added the money to the fund and wrote a simple thank you, no signature, no ceremony. As months passed, the city adjusted to its new rhythms. There were still long lines, still shortages, still nights when nothing seemed to work. But there were also moments, quiet ones, that made the effort worth it. A child walking out with medicine in hand, a mother smiling with relief, a guard holding a door open without being asked. On a warm evening, Oluwafemi invited Hannah to a small gathering. No press, no speeches, just a few people who had carried the work forward. "I want you to see this," he said, handing her a document. It was a proposal, formal, thoughtful. A permanent role coordinating emergency outreach and ethics training across multiple facilities. Hannah read it slowly. "This is a lot," she said. "You don't have to decide now," Oluwafemi replied, "but it belongs to you if you want it." She looked up. "Why me?" "Because you choose people over convenience," he said, "and you stay." Hannah thought of the gate, the concrete, the choice. "I'll think about it," she said. That night she returned home and opened her notebook. She reread the lines she had written weeks ago, then added another beneath them. "Staying changes everything." The next morning, Hannah went back to the hospital and did what she had always done. Checked charts, listened closely, made careful decisions. No announcements, no applause, just work. And as the sun rose over the city, casting light on doors that opened a little faster, now Hannah Abiola felt certain of one thing. What began as a single act of defiance had become a way of living. The choice Hannah Abiola had been postponing refused to stay quiet. It followed her through corridors and clinics, through the soft clatter of cups at the shelter and the low hum of the market at dusk. It sat beside her at night when the city settled and her notebook lay open, waiting for words. The proposal from Oluwafemi Oyakali did not ask for urgency, but it demanded honesty. Hannah understood what it meant. Accepting the role would pull her away from the bedside more often than she liked. It would place her in meetings on roads between facilities, inside systems she had once challenged from the outside. Declining it would keep her exactly where she felt most useful, hands steady, ears open, present in the small moments that rarely make reports. Both paths mattered, only one could be hers. She decided to walk before deciding. At dawn, Hannah visited the old bus park. The concrete was the same, cracked, unforgiving, but the space felt altered. A small sign pointed toward a clinic schedule. A volunteer handed out water. A guard stood nearby, attentive rather than dismissive. Hannah stood where she had knelt once, breathing in the early air. She did not replay the moment. She let it be what it was, a beginning. Later that morning, she met Nancy Wanjala at the market. Nancy was arranging produce with practiced care, her posture straighter than it had been in years. Customers greeted her by name. "You look like someone with a decision," Nancy said, smiling. Hannah laughed softly. "Do I?" "You always do," Nancy replied. "What is it?" Hannah told her about the role, the responsibility, the fear of becoming distant from the very people she wanted to serve. Nancy listened without interrupting. When Hannah finished, Nancy nodded. "You taught me something," Nancy said, "that staying doesn't always mean standing still." Hannah considered that. "And you taught me that living takes courage," she replied. Nancy reached across the stall and squeezed her hand. "Then choose the courage that keeps you honest." At the hospital, Dr. Kwame Adebayo was grappling with his own reckoning. The months of change had humbled him. He found himself less certain and more effective. When Hannah asked for a meeting, he agreed immediately. "I won't pretend I understand everything yet," he said, "but I understand this: the hospital works better when we listen." Hannah nodded. "I'm considering a role that would take me across facilities," she said. "If I accept, I'll need your cooperation." Dr. Kwame smiled faintly. "You'll have it," he said. "And my respect." Nurse Zainab Sadiq approached Hannah later that day, her expression careful but open. "I heard," Zainab said, "about the offer." Hannah met her gaze. "I haven't decided." Zainab nodded. "Whatever you choose," she said, "I'll keep doing the work here differently." Hannah smiled. "That's enough." That evening, Hannah returned to the shelter. A small group had gathered, people newly arrived, people newly hopeful. Nancy sat among them, listening more than speaking. When someone asked how she had survived, Nancy answered simply. "Someone stayed," she said. "Then others did too." Hannah felt the truth of it settle into her bones. She went home and opened her notebook. The page filled slowly, not with plans, but with reasons, faces, names, moments, the guard who held the door, the junior nurse who learned to trust her hands, the man who walked out with medicine because someone said yes. By the time the city quieted, Hannah had made her decision. The next morning she met Oluwafemi Oyakale, where the city overlooked itself, buildings layered against the sky, busy and vulnerable all at once. "I'll accept," Hannah said. "On one condition." Oluwafemi smiled. "Name it." "I keep a shift," she said, "every week, at a bedside. If I lose that, I lose my compass." He nodded without hesitation. "Agreed." The work expanded, not overnight, not without friction. Hannah traveled between facilities, trained teams, listened to stories that shaped policies more honestly than any spreadsheet. She argued when she had to. She compromised when it served people rather than pride. And she kept her shift. At the hospital, staff learned to recognize her not as a symbol, but as a colleague who asked hard questions and stayed to help answer them. At clinics, her presence reassured teams that ethics were not a threat to efficiency, but its ally. Nancy's life continued to grow. The market cooperative offered her a permanent stall. She moved into a small room of her own. She volunteered at intake days, greeting newcomers with the calm confidence of someone who had crossed the threshold and returned to guide others. On a warm afternoon months later, the mobile clinic returned to the bus park. The line formed quickly, but it moved. Children laughed. Elders rested in shade. Hannah stood beside the van, checking referrals, greeting familiar faces. A woman approached hesitantly, eyes tired, hands empty. "Can I be seen?" she asked. Hannah met her eyes and nodded. "Yes," she said, "you can." As the sun dipped, Oluwafemi joined her. They watched the clinic wind down, no fanfare, just the quiet relief of needs met. "You kept your condition," he said. Hannah smiled. "I kept my promise." That night, Hannah returned home and wrote one final line in her notebook beneath the others. "Choosing people builds the future." She closed the book. The city outside hummed imperfect, resilient, alive. Doors opened a little faster now. Hands reached out a little sooner. Systems bent not because they were forced, but because someone had shown them how. Hannah Abiola washed her hands, set out her clothes for the next day, and rested. Tomorrow would bring new questions. She was ready to stay. At the heart of this story is a simple truth we often forget. Kindness is not weakness, and compassion is never wasted. Hannah Abiola did not save Nancy Wanjala because she expected a reward. She did not act because she believed the world would be fair to her. She acted because in a single moment she chose to see a human being instead of a problem, a rule, or a risk. And that choice, made on hard concrete under an unforgiving sun, set something powerful in motion. Life does not always repay goodness immediately. Sometimes doing the right thing costs us comfort, security, even everything we think defines us. But this story reminds us that character outlives consequences, and integrity has a way of traveling farther than fear. One act of courage can awaken another. One person who stays can change an entire system that learned how to look away. Nancy's survival was not just about medicine, it was about being seen. Hannah's redemption was not about a job. It was about staying true to who she was, even when the cost was high. And Oluwafemi's response shows us that power, when guided by conscience, can heal instead of harm. So here's a question for you. If you were standing at that hospital gate, what would you have done? Would you have stayed, even if it meant losing everything? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters, and someone reading it might need your words more than you know. And if stories of compassion, justice, and real-life transformation move your heart, please subscribe to the channel. These stories are here to remind us again and again that humanity still matters. Thank you for watching.